Okay.
Okay.
Right.
Okay, Vincent, go ahead and start.
Wonderful. Okay, so welcome everybody. We have the pleasure of inviting art historian and conservator Dr. Habil Svitlana Olianina. Svitlana is the head of Department of Graphic Arts of the National Technical University of Ukraine, the Igor Sikorsky Polytechnic Institute in Kiev. Her focus is the historical design aspects of Ukrainian Iconostasis. She obtained her Ph.D. from the Department of the National Academy of Fine Arts and Architecture in Kiev in 2005. She previously interned at the Department of Fine Arts at the University of Granada in Spain in 1996 to 97, and she was the head of the Institute for Cultural Research at the National Academy of Arts of Ukraine in Kiev from 2008 to 2016, and achieved Dr. Habil status in 2020 from the Lviv National Academy of Arts. Over the years, she has published more than 50 articles of various aspects of iconostasis and its history, including her 2019 book, Ukrainian Iconostasis. So we're delighted to have Svitlana today, which is absolutely great. This is going to be a brilliant presentation. But as I said previously before, Yuri has kindly is acting as a Q&A facilitator and a translator. And just an introduction to Yuri. Yuri Yanchyshyn is a New York City-based conservator of wooden artifacts and a Fulbright specialist and scholar teaching wood conservation in Ukraine since 2018. So please, when you're ready, Svitlana, we'd like to see your presentation, please.
Thank you, Vincent. Thank you for the ICOMOS UK Wood Committee for inviting me to speak today. My presentation will focus on the Ukrainian iconostasis, its history, construction, and methods of preservation during the Soviet period after World War II. The word iconostasis refers to a partition in Christian church of Eastern Rite, typically made of wood, which separates the altar from the congregation. The religious purpose of this partition was to separate the area of the church where Eucharist is performed from other larger portion of the church accessible to all the faithful. In its current form, it consists of several tiers of icons, which are painted wooden panels of religious imagery with a double door passage to the altar in the central section, called the royal doors, and single doors on either side, called the deacon's doors. The origin of this form dates to 6th century Byzantium. This is a partition separating the sanctuary from the nave, called a temple. Over time, this barrier evolved into the architectural construction we know today. The Eastern Slavic iconostasis originated at the end of the medieval period in the 14th to 15th centuries as a simple horizontal icon panel support called a tableau, which consisted of wood beams set onto the walls or the post pillars of a church. In wooden churches, they formed a part of the church construction. Groups of icons were placed on these beam members, today called beam iconostasis, in 2 to 4 tiered rows. Although many of these icon groupings have survived to our present day, the beam iconostasis of this period have not. That is why we still do not have a definitive answer as to whether this early construction were merely simple support for icons or whether they were elaborately carved. This early beam iconostasis of the 15th to the first half of the 16th century did not have separating frames for the icons. The icons of the upper tiers were painted on long boards, and the individual religious narratives were separated by painted or engraved vertical stripes. In contrast, framed iconostasis, these individual painted icons probably existed by the end of the 16th century, as documented by a drawing of such a construction found in the personal diary of Martin Grunewald from the 1580s of the Church of the Assumption in Lviv, today in Western Ukraine. The earliest and best preserved iconostasis in Ukraine is in the Paraskeva Church in Lviv, in Western Ukraine, circa 1610s. This construction is representative of a transformation which took place in the 16th century. The medieval horizontal beam iconostasis was transformed during this early modern period into the iconostasis as we know it today, a frame construction. As you can see, every icon in the iconostasis of the Paraskeva Church has its own enclosure, and the entire iconostasis is covered with relief carvings. However, this new iconostasis was not a complex of several different frames. It was a unified architectural form containing architectural elements such as arched passages to the altar, columns, consoles, and corbels. In central Ukraine, the architectural and decorative design of the iconostasis of the Kiev Metropolitanate also underwent a similar development at the end of the 16th century. Even so, they still retained the horizontal rows of icons, as in the beam iconostasis. This construction in central and eastern Ukraine reached their apogee during the second half of the 17th century through the first half of the 18th century, when the Baroque style prevailed in Ukraine. Their specific architecture and ornamentation became their most characteristic feature, which distinguished them from other national variants of that period. During this period of icons, in the central portion of the iconostasis became elevated. This began with a slight stepwise rising of the cornice above the royal doors portal. This led to the introduction in the 18th century of cornices, these concentric curved arches above the royal doors. This in turn led to the central form of the iconostasis rising significantly, resembling a mountain. Thus, this iconostasis of the 17th to 18th centuries created a previously unknown impression of commanding monumentality. The increase in height was significant. The iconostasis of the first half of the 17th century are typically 4 to 6 meters in height. However, by the second half of the 17th century to 18th century, many of them were up to 20 to 22 meters high. To achieve this imposing scale, the individual icon panels became larger and the number of icon tiers increased. While the iconostasis of the first half of the 17th century had 4 to 5 tiers, they could have 6 to 7 tiers by the end of the century. This period was also highlighted by a pronounced flourishing of iconostasis decoration. Entire surfaces became elaborately and densely carved with gilded and sometimes silver flowers. fruit garlands and rosettes, lachacanthus leaves and vines. These carved floral motifs were not only three-dimensional, but were often mounted in two layers in the iconostasis lower tiers. As a result, the iconostasis began to take on the form of an open pierced gilded curtain. As a liturgical object, the composition, decorative carvings, and painted surfaces of the iconostasis were richly symbolic. As such, the sponsors of the largest and most complex structures of the Kyiv Metropolitan churches were its hierarchs. They would initiate a project, either orally or in writing, and then hire the best carving and painting masters to execute it. The carving masters were called snitsas, and they created the architectural and decorative section of the iconostasis with the assistance of apprentices. Although most of the masters' names have been lost, a few examples have survived in documents. For example, it is known from invoices and other work documents that the carving of the iconostasis of the Assumption Church in Lviv of 1629 to 38 were executed by Stanislav Drier, and the 1729 iconostasis of the Assumption Church, Assumption Cathedral in the Kiev Pechersk Lavra was carved by the snitzer Grigory Petrov. At that time, every major city in Ukraine had master carvers and groups of their apprentices. Therefore, we occasionally come across name of masters in Kyiv, Chernihiv, Nizhyn, Poltava, Lubny in archival documents. In Western Ukraine, significant artistic centers were Lviv and Zhovko, whose masters built and carved the iconostasis of that region. Regional carving styles are distinguishable. Kyiv and Eastern Ukraine are characterized by bold three-dimensional open pierced carving, while in Western Ukraine, low relief carving dominated. The situation changed in the second half of the 17th to 18th century, when it became very costly to build large iconostases which were richly carved and decorated. Only the wealthiest monasteries and magnates could finance such undertakings. Among the latter, the Cossack hetmans were the most frequent benefactors and sponsors. Historic documentation reveals that formal contracts existed between the sponsors and the individuals who would execute the iconostasis buildings and decoration. Typically, these documents describe the arrangement in general terms, primarily focusing on the quality of the materials, such as specifying pigments from Venice and the carving. These only the payment terms outlined in detail. For example, a rather complete contract has been preserved of the 1685 construction of the iconostasis of the Transfiguration Cathedral of the Mharsky Monastery, concluded between the hetman Ivan Samoilovich and the carver Stepan Mutyanitsa. It states that the master will undertake the building and carving of an iconostasis according to a drawing provided to him. In turn, the hetman is responsible for the payment of 2,000 Polish coins to the carver and his apprentices, as well as providing for their lodging and sustenance. Fascinating details include the provision of textiles for clothes, firewood, candles, and among other, 15 cows, 60 sheep, and 20 pigs for food. The construction of this iconostasis lasted 4 years, from 1685 to 1689. For that period, 2 to 4 years was typical for such an undertaking, provided that the work was continuous. Linden was the work of choice used for the carving and icon panels, while the woods used for the frames of the iconostasis are being researched. The joinery of large structural elements is also being researched. Carvings were executed directly on the main structural elements, while smaller ornamental carved fragments were adhered with protein glue and fastened with wooden pins or wooden nails. The mounted decor was carved with levkas, Ukrainian for gesso, and a coating of ball, and then water gilded or oil gilded with gold leaf. Individual carved elements, such as flowers or grapes, were occasionally silvered and then given a transparent glaze of colored varnishes in red or green hues. Structural elements which were not covered with a carved decor were usually painted blue or white. Other colors, such as red, were also introduced in the middle of the 18th century. The Baroque period, the high point in Ukrainian iconostasis art, ended during the middle of the third quarter of the 18th century. A new style, classicism, began to develop in the following years, bringing with it a very different set of aesthetic ideals in ecclesiastical art. Later, increasingly during the 19th century, the artistic forms of the Ukrainian Baroque iconostasis were no longer fashionable and were thought of as hopelessly out of date. The Russian Empire's ruling and cultural elite considered them to be of little value, and they were only left in place due to the high cost of constructing new ones. At the first opportunity, however, such an iconostasis would be replaced and it would be dismantled, sold in parts to small parish churches, or were stored, such as in bell tower, where they gradually deteriorated. Be that as it may, losses of the Ukrainian Baroque iconostasis due to natural aging or stylistic replacement were minimal during the 19th century. Most of them were still intact in their churches at the beginning of the 20th century. Although some of the lost during period of World War I and shortly afterwards, it was only during the Soviet period of the 1930s that iconostasis found themselves at the epicenter of governmental anti-religious initiatives. Churches were closed and services were forbidden, being thought of as opium for the people, a phrase that appeared in numerous publications of the Soviet Ukraine. For example, here you can see a fencing off of the iconostasis before dismantled. Afterwards, the began of the purposeful destruction of religious artifacts. Very preliminary statistic, numbering about 400, were cut into pieces and burned. This destruction was not limited to iconostasis, but included the Torah Ark of Jewish synagogues or the carved altars from Roman Catholic churches as well. During this period, A very small number of icons and individual carvings were saved by museum staff members as examples of icon painting styles or the history of the decorative arts. Any reference to the destruction of these masterpieces in Soviet publication of the time was strictly prohibited. By the time World War II began, most iconostases of the Eastern Ukraine were destroyed, and any surviving members were then heavily damaged during the war period. These anti-religious initiatives ceased in the post-war period. The catastrophic level of cultural heritage destruction during the 30s and war period prompted Soviet authorities to change their attitude to the remaining religious art objects. During the 1960s, programs of the preservation and restoration of cultural heritage objects began to include iconostasis as well. It should be emphasized that not a single 17th century iconostasis remained in Eastern Ukraine at the time, and only 7 18th century Baroque iconostasis miraculously survived in various states of damage. These iconostases were restored by governmental conservation institution during the late 1960s through the early 1990s. In the following portion of my presentation, I would like to highlight the restoration specific of two of them, the Sorochinsy iconostasis of 1731 to 1732, and the iconostasis from Kozelets village from 1752 to 1763. Today, the Sorochinsy iconostasis remains an unsurpassed masterpiece of Ukrainian Baroque art. It was constructed under the patronage of Hetman Danilo Apostol for the church building he had built on his ancestral estate. Information regarding the church builders or iconostasis carvers is unknown. However, the quality of the icon painting suggests that the best painters of the time created them. Baptist Pavlovsky from Kiev, Pechersk Lavra, or Vasily Ryklinsky from Poltava. The structure reached a height of 17 meters and a width of 22 meters, spanning the entire width of the church. The Sorochinsy iconostasis housed 130 icons painted in oil on a Levkaz ground using a multi-layered painting and glazing technique. Restoration documents of the 1960s note that the iconostasis carvings were executed in linden. Wood identification of the structural members is being planned. Although this church managed to avoid the purposeful governmental destruction of the 1930s, other tragedies befell it. Bombing during the World War II significantly damaged it, and then it stood with a ruined dome and unglazed windows for a long period of time. Atmospheric precipitation and wide temperature fluctuations quickly added to the damage of the iconostasis. A further tragedy was a lightning strike and a fire in 1961. Then restorers examined it in the second half of the 1960s. The Sorochinsy iconostasis evoked the appearance of half-ruined masterpiece. It was structurally unstable, had lost 12 of its icons, as well as numerous decorative carved sections. The gilded levkaz covering the carving, as well as the icon painting surfaces, were delaminating or lost in many areas. The rescue of this iconostasis began with a complete before treatment photo documentation, followed by a scientific analysis of the painted and decorative surfaces. This analysis became the basis of the treatment protocol, which began in 1969. The icons were designated from the iconostasis and transported to Kyiv to be restored, while the iconostasis structure was conserved and restored on site. Treatment of the iconostasis began destabilizing the iconostasis structural elements, utilizing either height or sturgeon glue. A particularly challenging aspect of the treatment was restoration of lost fragments of the iconostasis. Similar preserved decorative elements were selected as samples for restoration carving, which were then carried out with a faithful approximation of the original using the same wood, linden. Various surfaces, including the existing levkas and gilding, were stabilized with sturgeon glue, and then dust, salt, and other contaminants were removed using undocumented techniques. Newly prepared levkas was applied to original very small missing section and then painted with watercolors to imitate gilding. However, a key question arose as to the treatment of newly attached missing carved section. What should be the degree of the restoration intervention? A conservative approach was chosen in keeping these newly prescribed Soviet restoration practices of the time. An example of this approach is the frame surrounding the Madonna and Child. Large replacement missing carved section were left intact and not covering these levkas or gilding. This approach permitted the aesthetic reintegration of the iconostasis of the carving, while at the same time differentiation original surfaces from restoration efforts. As a result of this decision, the true volume of lost material is easily seen today. This treatment lasted 2 decades and was completed in the late 1980s. The restored icons were returned and reinstalled in the Sorochinsky iconostasis. The second restoration example is the iconostasis in the Cathedral of the Nativity of the Virgin in Kozelets village, Chernihiv region, which took place at the same time. This late Baroque iconostasis reached a height of 27 meters in its central section. In the 1960s, this iconostasis was in very poor and damaged condition, with many missing icons, including all the royal and Dickens doors. As with the previous example, the remaining icons were disengaged from the iconostasis and sent to Kiev for restoration. In contrast, the previous example, upon completion of their restoration, the icons were installed in the Chernihiv Museum. New icons, not identical to the original, were then painted and installed in the original iconostasis. This decision negated the historic integrity of the iconostasis and diluted its importance as a historic document. However, the restoration of iconostasis itself is fascinating, since the restorer, Mr. Amram Poisky, left very detailed documentation regarding of his procedures, formulation, and ingredients, providing us with an opportunity to look back and reflect on the restoration practices of more than 40 years ago. A brief outline follows. The entire iconostasis was disinfected on both sides with a 4% formalin solution in water for the painted surfaces and 4% formalin solution in alcohol for the gilded surfaces. This was done to disinfect the surfaces from any mold or surface insect activity. Paint layers of the iconostasis and the levkas of the gilded and carved surfaces were stabilized with an emulsion of damar varnish, purified beeswax and pinene, a further destruction of turpentine. The proportion of these ingredients varied depending on various surfaces. The laminating paint layers included the ground, the laminating paint layers with the ground intact, or the laminating ground gilding layers. The stabilization procedure was interesting as well. Tracing paper impregnated this, the warm emulsion was laid to the surface and lightly pressed with small heated spatulas. Surface contaminants of the paint layers were removed after 3 to 5 days of stabilization using a slightly acidic soap solution at pH 5.5. The levkas, gesso, losses were filled with restoration levkas made of chalk, casein, linseed oil, and an oil varnish. A protective isolating layers was applied to all surfaces which would be painted or turned. This emulsion consisted of 1 part of damar varnish, 2 parts of pinene, 1 part of linseed oil. Painting lost areas were painted with oil paints dispersed in a solution of 100 grams of damar varnish, 100 grams of pinene, and 10 grams of beeswax. Lost carving fragments were replaced with new carvings using existing samples as models. A section of wood of the same species was attached with a protein glue and wooden pins at the carving loss areas. The wood was selected considering the fiber direction of the original fragment. The wood was then carved, then left it from original section as in the Sorochinsky iconostasis. This treatment record was very complete for its day, listing the ingredients and the step-by-step methods of preparing the emulsions and coatings. It gave practical advice on application techniques and time intervals between each procedure. Now, what can be said in these 2 treatment examples executed in the 1970s through 1980s, imperfect as they are by today's standards, is that they stabilized the objects, differentiated between original and restoration efforts, and prevented the further deterioration of 2 outstanding examples of 18th century Ukrainian iconostasis art. They are preserved to our present day. I would like to conclude my presentation with the complex iconostasis history of one notable church, the Church of Saint Ili, built in Subotiv, central Ukraine, in 1653. It is unknown what happened to the original iconostasis. A replacement iconostasis in the classical style was installed in the 19th century, which in turn was destroyed by the Soviets in the 1930s. The church was then used as a storage facility. After Ukraine declared independence in 1991, period photographs were used to recreate the 19th century iconostasis. However, this recreation was not completely faithful, as you can see in the treatment of the royal doors. During the 2000 congregation decided to install still another iconostasis, carved in the Baroque style, a style which today has assumed a national ubiquitous character. This example of iconostasis originally created for their churches, which then became either lost or destroyed, followed by multiple iconostasis creations, replacement, transformation, and recreations, highlight the challenging issues of historical authenticity that await anyone who delves into Ukraine iconostasis history and their conservation. Thank you for your attention. This concludes my presentation. However, I have two additional slides, which you can see access on the recorded version of this presentation, should you have an interest. This slide highlights a short Ukrainian language bibliography of this subject. And this slide highlights my contact information should you be interested in purchasing my book, Ukrainian Iconostasis, Symbolism and Iconology in Ukraine. Thank you.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Fantastic. Thank you very, very, very much. Great. That was absolutely fascinating. The quality of craftsmanship is incredible. And I would imagine that I wondered if there were certain regions that were particularly famous for the quality, or whether it was across the board. That was the sort of question I had.
Пані Світлано, прошу переказати, чи були якісь дуже славні регіони в Україні, які прославлялися своїм різьбарством для тих іконостасів?
Іконостаси Центральної України, відомі центри, це Київ і Чернігів.
So the regions found in today's central Ukraine around the cities of Kyiv, which is today the capital of Ukraine, and Chernihiv, which was one of the capitals of the Cossack hetmans for a period of time, had the best examples of carving styles where you have the multi-layered open pierced carving. So this would be carving executed in 2 or maybe even more layers in an open pierced style, and then joined together either with wooden nails or wooden pins.
Right.
Найбільші іконостаси створювалися для головних храмів Києва і Чернігова, а потім є відомості, що вони передавалися в церкви інших регіонів, інших міст.
So the largest iconostases were built in the cities of Kyiv and Chernihiv, but the carving expertise and the building expertise of these iconostases was then transferred to other countries.
Wow, amazing. Fantastic. Joe, you had a question?
Hi, Vincent. Hi, Svitlana. Thank you very much. Amazing. So many thoughts sparked off by that. But you kindly answer my question that linden or lime was the carving material, which Grinling Gibbons, we have a famous carver in England in the same period, in the late 1600s, early 1700s, who was carving in lime these very wonderful three-dimensional pierced carvings. I don't know, Vincent, if you've worked with any of Grinling Gibbons' work.
We've worked in the rooms at Kensington Palace where there were Gibbons works in, so we had to be very careful working around it, but not actually on it itself. So was it a mixture of, is it lime and then other softwood, typical sort of Baltic pine, I would imagine?
I have an interesting comment to make about all of that, because 30 years ago, I had an internship at Wiggins and Sons in London, and I made a little pilgrimage to St. Paul's. And at that time, Tony Webb, one of your wonderful carvers, gave me a personal tour of the carving replacements that were happening in the choir stall of St. Paul's at the time. So that was a wonderful introduction for me personally of Grinling Gibbons.
Yeah, it's great. And the other question, was that from you, Joe, about dendrochronology?
Yes, but it may not be possible, I guess, with lime.
Okay, I didn't know that.
Svitlana, чи виконалася яка-небудь дендрохронологія іконостасію?
Наскільки мені відомо, поки що ні.
So dendrochronology has not been performed on any of the iconostasis so far.
Rarely
but they have plans to identify not only the woods in the structure, but also in the to definitively identify the carvings as well.
Right.
Можливо, така дендрологія виконувалася при реставрації музею у Львові іконостасів, але просто мені про це не відомо. Просто я не володію цією інформацією наразі.
Potentially, an investigation of that nature may have been performed in the affiliates of the conservation studios currently in Lviv in Western Ukraine, but they are unknown to Svitlana.
It would be very difficult to conduct dendrochronology on those, since those are highly worked pieces of wood that likely did not retain the waning edge or the last year of growth. Right now, it would only be possible through accelerator mass spectrometry of individual tree rings.
Yeah, good point. There's another question from is it Vandy? What are the paint binders? So the painting binders, are they oil, egg tempera, and depending on time and place of variety, or are they a variety of these? So.
Які є зв'язуючі у малярстві тих ваших ікон? Чи це є здебільшого темпера, чи це є олійні фарби, і чи ті два методики розрізняються по різних періодах у розвитку українського малярства?
Це питання наразі вивчається. Це дуже цікаве питання. У мене є інформація за останнє дослідження. І не останнє, а, скажімо, перше таке дослідження, присвячене саме зв'язуючими, завершено в цьому році. Я можу відповісти.
So this is a very interesting question, and it's currently in the process of further investigation. And Svitlana has some additional information current to this year, and she would be able to provide you with that detailed information if you send her an email.
Right.
And the email is provided on the last slide of the presentation.
Yeah, perfect. Just see if there's any other questions here. Did you want to ask Myron? Were you asking to a question? No. Sorry, I thought you put your hand up. Okay, Thomas.
Svitlana, I would encourage you to map a lot of the themes that you portrayed. For a non-specialist, there's so many possibilities of carving and compositional organization. I would have liked to see some maps that showed me areas that concentrated and all that. I mean, it's ambitious. There's lots of ways you can do mapping, but for outsiders, I think that would be very important to at least link composition or carving styles or something like that as best you could to generate all sorts of things. For example, from what little I know, for synagogues, wooden synagogues, there's plenty of themes of vegetation carving in columns or composition or things like that could be compared geographically. And I just encourage you to try to do that with any kind of typology of these synagogues or churches or the carving that you can. It would be helpful for someone like me that doesn't have that geographic familiarity with some of the towns that you were portraying. Thank you. Very good presentation. Exciting.
Дуже цікава заувага до вас, пані Світлано, що пан Томас питає вас, чи існують ілюстрації тих різних різьбарств, щоб тоді порівняти цей дизайн тих різних різьбарств, можливо, з розвитком декоративного різьбарства на Заході, і тим способом порівняти розвиток цього різьбарства на Україні з іншими країнами. Чи це існує?
Спробу показати, як розвивалося різьбарство української іконостаси, я зробила в своїй книжці. Там достатньо креслень, можна це подивитися. Поки що це єдине таке дослідження, де було дослідження різьбарства саме іконостасів з кресленнями з різних регіонів, іконостасів різних регіонів.
Svitlana's answer is that there are lots of examples of her point-by-point illustrations of many carvings on the iconostases found in her book, which then can be linked to the development of the carving of decorative arts elements in the West. So this potentially shows the exchange of ideas that happened between Ukraine and the Western countries.
Right. Yeah, sorry.
Me?
Yeah, carry on. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you, Svitlana. It's I guess it's really curious. I'm an art historian from Ukraine too, and I'm really appreciate the Svitlana book and her investigation of Ukrainian iconostasis. I have a question about the changes of decorative scheme of these Ukrainian iconostasis of the 18th century. What do you think about, you don't mention the differences and maybe even confessional rivalry between two denominations, between Orthodox, Ukrainian Orthodox and Ukrainian Uniate or Greek Catholic Church, and different decorative programs of these iconostasis, for example, in the central Ukraine and in the Western Ukraine. So this is my question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Питання є, чи існують різниці між різьбарством на Західній Україні і Центральній Україні не то по регіонах, але по релігійних конфесіях, тобто православ'я і українсько-католицькі українсько-католицьке віровизнання.
Різбярська програма іконостасів це була програма символічна. Вона складалася в залежності від концепції, яка
So the iconostasis creation was in fact highly symbolic, and it was determined by the church hierarchy.
І тому вона розрізняється скоріше не за регіонами, а за різними концепціями.
So this difference in the carving styles has more to do with the ecclesiastical differences between Orthodoxy and Eastern Rite Catholicism rather than regional styles.
Коли змінювалися концепції, змінювалася програма різьблення, і між греко-католицькими і православними іконостасами до 30-х років 18 століття відмінностей в програмах серйозних не спостерігається.
So there were in fact differences in these ecclesiastical requirements for the creation of these iconostases, especially in the first half of the 18th century, but that those differences are not as discernible today.
Деякі відмінності фіксуються вже всередині 18 століття.
So the major differences happened in the middle of the 18th century, the stylistic carving differences, that is.
Не стилістичні, а програмні, тобто як за змістом декору.
So this was not actually a stylistic difference between these two types of iconostases formed by these two Christian denominations, but it was a difference in the actual choice of the religious imagery and its execution.
So,
Great.
Any other questions?
Yep, but there's another question from Jana van Dijk. Jana is asking, what are the current challenges for you around the conservation and preservation of the iconostasis? And so basically, yeah, just what are the challenges in conserving these screens?
Які є виклики сьогодні для консервації тих іконостасів в Україні?
Музейні іконостаси, які знаходяться в храмах, які охороняються державою, вони знаходяться під контролем реставраційних організацій і організацій державних, які захищають ці іконостаси від неконтрольованих реставрацій.
So the major iconostases that are found in the greatest churches are under the auspices of the government, and their conservation is executed by governmental restoration facilities who have the authority and the responsibility for their conservation. So those are in fact more or less protected from improper restorations. Others, however, are not.
Wow. Anybody else? Any other questions?
Yeah, may I ask something? Do we have a few minutes?
Yeah.
Thank you, Svitlana, for your presentation. I am also from Ukraine, and I have a question. Can we see at least few pages from your book right now? It will be very interesting to compare Ukrainian iconostasis to like Eastern European or others, if it's possible, if it's in our schedule.
Пані Світлано, пані Тимо вас просить, чи ви б не могли порівняти дизайн, виконавство та іконографію, іконостасію з тими великими заслонами, які існують з малярством на Заході, тобто в Італії, в Німеччині, в Польщі, наприклад. Які є великі різниці, які є так само великі споєднані думки?
Я може скажу пані Світлані українською, пані Світланко, можемо побачити кілька сторінок з вашої книги, щоб це візуалізувати, раз ви цю роботу зробили? Це було моє перше питання. Я зразу задам друге, щоб потім швидше це було. Чи ви знайомі з таким фактом, що багато в Сербії збереглося іконостасів, які були зроблені майстрами, які навчалися в Києво-Печерській лаврі? Чи вам знайомі ці дослідження і щось про це більше?
Я зрозуміла. Мою книжку є ось посилання на сайт академії, кілька сторінок можна побачити там.
So there are a couple of pages in my book regarding the comparison of Ukrainian iconostases with these large wooden panel constructions that are typically found in the West, for example, like in Italy or in Germany or in Poland, that also hold large wooden panels. And there's a comparison of those two different approaches.
Чи можна його кинути в чат, бо я не бачу цього посилання. Я не знаю, де воно є.
На презентації, які я робила, там є посилання і, звичайно, можна буде. З приводу другого питання, про те, що майстри Києво-Печерської лаври виконували іконостаси, я знаю, втім ці іконостаси виконані в традиціях яблової конструкції іконостасів Сербії. Тобто йдеться про те, що ці майстри не вплинули на розвиток архітектоніки сербських іконостасів. Тобто вони працювали в межах тої традиції, яку розвивала Сербія.
So it's interesting about regarding the potential influences of iconostases in Ukraine as opposed to in other countries. There were large iconostases in Serbia as well, and their craftsmen and painters and carvers worked on the iconostases in the Lavra, which is in the largest, one of the largest and oldest religious complexes in the capital in Kyiv. And they were executing the iconostases that is currently in the Lavra based on their own particular skills and design motifs.
Чи можна ще про Сербію півпитання? Наскільки я знаю, вони запозичили з Києва, але це була і східна, і західна традиція. Значить, пробачте, це була традиція, яка була і на сході, і на заході України поширена, ряд неділь п'ятидесятниць. І так, воно було тяблове, але це була інновація богословська, яка виглядає, що була створена в нас на Україні, причому відразу в двох конфесіях. І цю інновацію запозичили сербські майстри. Вони не тільки українці їм робили на замовлення, їхні серби вчилися в Києво-Печерській лаврі і повезли потім цю традицію до себе. Зараз серби самі це досліджують і питаються нас, як то в нас.
Трошечки повільніше, тобто прошу поставити просте питання для пані Світлани.
Yes. Do you know a little bit about something about боже, я вже не можу зараз по-англійську сказати, ряд неділь п'ятидесятниць, що він був запозичений сербськими майстрами з наших іконостасів високих, як західноукраїнських, так і східноукраїнських.
So the question is regarding the stylistic and carving development of particular icons. And we're kind of getting into very deep territory over here. So Svitlana, do you want to say a few words regarding that?
Дякую за питання. Справа в тому, що я спеціалізуюся на архітектоніці і різьбленні, і тому саме ці питання досліджувала в іконостасах. Іконографія – це не так глибоко займаюся. Дякую.
Svitlana answers that she is specializing in the stylistic development of the iconostases, and the question form of expertise. Any other questions?
If I might be able to add something, those of you who have access to academia.com online, there's at least a dozen articles by Svitlana available there, both several in English, but most in Ukrainian, but several in English as well.
Okay, Vincent,
Wonderful.
any other questions?
No, unless anybody else has got any other questions. That was absolutely fantastic, and it was a real a treat for us to get access to this that we normally wouldn't. So it's very much appreciated that you presented for us today. So thank you very much. The recording will be sent out in a few days, and I've also taken some emails from people that will go on the mailing list. So our next presentation is next month. We have them every month, and please do join us.
Vincent, thank you.
Thank you very much, Yuri. Thank you for translating it and fielding the questions.
Thank you.
Thank you, Svitlana. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.